Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Floating Head of Simon TV. Wonderful that you could all join me on a Sunday evening. Now, those of you who watch the broadcast fairly regularly will know that I'm deeply uninterested in American politics. Whenever the subject comes up, I say, look, I'm really interested in the United States' impact on the world, but I'm very much less interested in the blow-by-blow of their domestic policies. For a small trading nation like New Zealand, which really is a leaf on the wind of international affairs, what matters most to a small trading nation is people out there in the world buying our goods. And when I started thinking about how New Zealand could maximize the opportunities of a Trump presidency while looking to minimize the potential impact of a growing rise of protectionism around the world, and something which Mr. Trump himself has advocated for, the person I thought that I should talk to about that, who would know more about it than anyone I think probably alive who's a New Zealander, is Sir Alexander Lockwood Smith. Now, most of you will remember Sir Lockwood as a television host, as a senior cabinet minister, and of course as the very best speaker of the House of Representatives that New Zealand has ever had. When I think of Sir Lockwood, I think of him as an academic, because that's how I knew him first. He is a scientist. He holds a doctorate from the University of Adelaide. I've never read Sir Lockwood's PhD thesis, but I know someone who has, who tells me that it's actually good. Since resigning, or rather retiring from New Zealand political life, Sir Lockwood has been exceptionally busy. He was our representative to the court at St James, where he worked extremely hard on New Zealand's behalf. He's been involved in many trade negotiations, both on behalf of New Zealand and on the behalf of the United Kingdom, and of course involved with many supra-national organisations such as the Commonwealth Secretariat. And I'm really fortunate that he has agreed to come on and speak with me this evening about New Zealand's place in the world, about trade relations, about international relations. And so I'm just going to remember to turn his microphone on, I hope, and I think I have. And there you are. Good evening, Sir Lockwood.
Good evening. Good evening, Simon.
It's wonderful to have you on.
It's special to be able to have a chat with you. For some reason or other, a phone just rang, and my screen has now gone blank.
Has it? Oh, okay. So you can no longer see me.
No. But,
okay. All right. Well,
I don't know what caused the phone to ring through the computer, but I'm not sure what to click on to get it back on.
Okay.
Podcasts, or should I try podcasts?
What I think we might do, what I might do is I might tell the audience that we've got some technical issues. I think what will need to happen is for you to just close this web browser where the call is occurring, and me and the audience will listen to some music until you join back on. How about that?
Thanks so much, and apologies, Si. That's unbelievable. That could.
Well, okay, good. All right, I'll see you back in a moment. Okay, everyone. Really sorry about that. While I was doing the introduction to the phone, I could hear it ringing on the broadcast before I turned on his microphone, and it sounds like it's actually connected to his MacBook. So it's going to be a little bit of a moment before he jumps back on, but that is okay. It gives me an opportunity to say good evening to some of the regulars who are here. I see that Giorgio is here. Good evening, young sir. Steve Evans is here. Hello. What are you about? Steve asks. Oh, yeah, no, it's just me and my nonsense. PVP is here. Hello. Misha is here. Good evening. And who else? Oh, Shelley the Kiwi. Hello. And Shortland Chambers as well. And Shortland Chambers notes Sir Lockwood, then Jinhao 80 is a Magic Sunday. Yeah, it's going to be. I will get to the fountain pen segment, fun with fountain pens, later on after I've finished speaking with Lockwood. As here, good evening, and good evening to Sir Lockwood. I'm sure that he very much appreciates that everyone appreciates him taking the time to speak with us. Shelley says, it's skipping, sorry to hear that. Dave says, anyone in tech knows Demo Hell. And Waitbra says, isn't it the absolute legend, Sir Lockwood? Yes, he is indeed. Guys, okay, I'm just going to play a little bit more music and get Sir Lockwood sorted out in the background. Sorry for the disruption, probably just be another couple of minutes. Listen to some tunes in the meantime, and I'll be right back with you.
Well, Simon, not just New Zealanders, but in fact, many countries are quite nervous about the election, the Trump election, because, Trump's made it very clear that he intends to impose tariffs on goods and services from not just countries like China, but impose them on imports from all countries. And so we in New Zealand here are expecting that we could have to face tariffs being imposed on our goods as well. I think the big thing with Trump, though, and in fact, Boris Johnson, the former UK Prime Minister, was in New Zealand last week, and he made this point too. With Boris, the important thing is to, okay, listen to what he says, but actually the important thing is what he does. And sometimes I'm expecting there will be tariffs. I'm expecting that in particular, China will probably have to face up to some real tariffs because there are issues around production for export in China. And the impact of some of the subsidies and support that Chinese businesses get does distort international markets. And so you can understand why Trump wants to take action against that because it has a huge impact on the UK market. I guess one item, for example, that's impacting global markets at the moment are EVs, electric motor vehicles. With all the different support arrangements in China, they're able to put them on world markets way below the price of EVs made in other countries. I mean, a good example would be the Ford Mustang Mach-E that is produced, well, that's an American car. Where it's built's another matter, and they've had to reduce the price of that. The GT version from 127,000 a couple of years ago down to 65,000 last month to compete here in New Zealand with Chinese imports into New Zealand. So you can understand why Trump's sort of wanting to take action against that. I think the key thing is we need to not panic. We need to keep building a good relationship with the Trump administration, and there's no reason why we can't do that. I think the current government is well positioned to do that. And then we need to be thoughtful about how we go about protecting our interests with the United States. And there's one interesting possibility. The United States has a trade agreement called USMCA, which is the agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And there's the possibility that the United States may expand that agreement, because of course there's no free trade agreement between the United Kingdom and the United States. And you'd think they'd automatically be able to have a free trade agreement now that the UK is out of the EU since Brexit. You'd think the UK would easily be able to have a free trade agreement with the United States. Two huge economies, it would make sense, absolute sense. But one way that might happen is maybe for the United Kingdom to dock in to the United States, Canadian, Mexican agreement. Sometimes that's a way to expand for trade agreements to work. For example, like CPTPP, the United Kingdom has recently docked into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if you like, and I was involved in helping them do that. And so it's a way of, at a time when new trade agreements are quite difficult, using existing ones and joining them is one way of making progress. And my point is, maybe New Zealand has a chance to do that. There's even been a wee bit of chatter in some of the key committees in the Congress about whether that might be a possibility or not. So, I'm hopeful, and I'm going to be encouraging any way I can. I have contacts still in the American system, and I think New Zealand just has to be very thoughtful and creative about how we take our trade relationship with the United States forward from here.
Fantastic, and I think I'll hit you up about that in terms of those relationships and contacts. For those who aren't aware, just how much this means to New Zealand, I did notice that it was 12 months ago that the United States exceeded Australia to become our number 2 trading partner, and of course, a huge amount of that trade, that bilateral trade from us in terms of exports, is very much primary sector. Now, the consideration that I have is that the world does seem to be moving a little bit away from globalization and becoming a little bit more protectionist. More upon that later. But one of the things that I notice about Trump as a person, Sir Lockwood, is that he is very much a person, it seems to me from the outside in, who is relationship driven. And I think when you talk about the United Kingdom, the potential for it to join the successor relationship to NAFTA, I do note that there were several weeks ago, Nigel Farage was talking about how he might leverage his personal relationships with Trump himself and with the Trump campaign to represent interests. And I think it would be reasonable from Great Britain's perspective to assume that the likes of Nigel Farage, the likes of Boris Johnson would be better at representing the interests of the United Kingdom than perhaps a Sir Keir Starmer or a David Lammy. So I know it's long-winded, but the question I have for you, Sir Lockwood, is who is New Zealand's Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson with those relationships to leverage with a Trump presidency?
I think New Zealand has not just one person. I think the Prime Minister, I think, has worked, is working on building his relationship with the United States new administration, and he will, because of his business experience in the United States, he's got a pretty good idea how things work over there, and that's helpful. I think, in fairness, our Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, I think he's built over the years a good relationship with the United States. And I agree with you, Simon. I think you're right that with the United States, relationships matter. But the reality this time around is even relationships are not going to stop the United States from taking quite a tough line on trade issues. And of course, President-elect Trump's been arguing that he wants to get the revenue from increased tariffs to help deliver tax cuts in the United States. And so he's pretty committed to increased tariffs. To me, what's interesting about that is that in the long run, tariffs hurt the countries that impose them far more than anyone else in the long run. In the long run, tariffs will raise the cost of living in the United States. And for a government, that's not that great. Raising the cost of living for your people doesn't, endear them to you, or endear you to them, if you like. But I think in the United States, what's interesting is raising tariffs in the short term can actually make people feel a lot better. It can help save jobs in some of the older manufacturing industries where they're having to compete with China, for example. And so in the short term, there can probably be political benefits, if you like, from raising tariffs. But the unfortunate thing is in the long term, they're bad for everyone. There's a commission that's been set up recently globally. It's based in the United Kingdom and the United States. And they've established, there's been a growth commission established. They've done a lot of modeling on what affects the economic well-being, the economic success of countries. And I guess the three things they've really focused on that have come out as top are trade and trade liberalization. Countries that trade more freely tend to do better. Regulation, and that's a big one. Countries that have less regulatory burden, if you like, do far better. And of course, lower taxes. Countries that have lower taxes enable people to invest more in productive enterprise. And so those three factors tend to, modeling has shown quite clearly that those factors have a very significant impact on economic growth. And so while President Trump may well raise tariffs, he's going to reduce regulation. There's no question about that. And the impact of that on the American economy will be very powerful. He did it in his first term. In his first term, he required for every new regulation brought in the United States, they had to get rid of 2 old ones. And it had quite a profound impact. And of course, the United States has tended to grow post-COVID economically far more than the EU. And of course, the EU is overburdened by regulation, tragically. And I've seen that at pretty close quarters.
Well, I'm sure you have, and it's very interesting because this has become quite the issue within the European Union trading bloc. We've seen over recent days, we've seen Angela Merkel release her magnum opus, which apparently is 800 pages, and I'm not particularly looking forward to wading through that. But I've seen some of the highlights of it summarized and talking about how the European Union has those sorts of challenges around regulation. Which is a comment that Van der Leyen has been echoing recently, and I think that there is. The European Union, I think they're in an interesting circumstance between appreciating that they do need to liberalise, but also being just by nature very, very protectionist. And do you think that is, how do you see a path forward for them, and how do you see a path forward for us in our relationship with them?
I think our relationship with the EU is important, of course, because Europe matters to us, and the EU is a very significant importer of sheep meat, of lamb from New Zealand. And following our free trade agreement with them, we hopefully will get a few more tons of beef into the EU as well. But you're right, Simon. The EU, it's interesting. I think they realise that regulation is holding them back a fair bit, but they really struggle to do anything about it. It's the whole, pre-Brexit sort of notion that the UK may remain, or should remain, if you like, in a reformed EU. A lot of that reform was about regulation, if you like, and the EU just could not deliver on it. And of course, that was one of the reasons that helped drive Brexit. And of course, the other big thing that drove Brexit was when Britain joined the common market. And it was the common market back in 1973 when Britain joined the EEC, if you like. That was fine. But of course, I think was it the Treaty of Rome, forgive me, subsequently in 1990, I should have checked that out, led beyond the common market to the notion of ever closer political union. And that was never going to work for the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom's heritage is so different. I mean, the United Kingdom was where modern democracy re-evolved, if you like, whereas much of continental Europe until the end of the Second World War was really under authoritarian regimes or dictatorships. So democracy and freedom, if you like, in Europe is much more recent than is the UK experience and heritage. And that's why it was not a difficult, would always have been a very difficult sort of political marriage, if you like, for the UK to become part of the United States of Europe, which is the aim of many involved in the great European project. That said, EU has still been so important because at least it has stopped countries in Europe from going to war every generation. So it's been hugely valuable, even though I'm at times critical of its over-regulation, its protectionist nature, and tends to be a wee bit sort of navel-gazing, if you like.
I know what you mean, and I'm quite reminded of the character Sir Humphrey Appleby in the wonderful series Yes, Minister, that you'll recall, where he speaks about the reason that the United Kingdom joined the European Union, or the EEC as it was at the time, and he said it was, that it was in Britain's interest to be a member, just to ensure that it didn't work, and he goes through and he describes all of the reasons why the various countries joined, and it's, France joined to protect its inefficient farmers, Germany to cleanse its hands of genocide and apply for readmission into the ranks of humanity, and so on and so forth. And it goes on to saying, well, look, Britain needs a nuclear deterrent because France has nuclear weapons, and let's face it, they are our ultimate enemy. So yes, you're exactly right. There is always going to be those sorts of frictions, and I think it is quite natural. Particularly, I think for the Brits, I think the big thing was for them was avoiding the single currency and giving up so much economic sovereignty by joining that. But I also see today that probably the most significant extrication, which they've still got to undertake, is from the judicial mechanisms, particularly the international, or rather the European Court of Justice. Have you had any inkling of how those sorts of negotiations are going on inside Europe?
No, that's beyond my expertise there, Simon. No, I'm not involved in that. Although I do know the UK is the new government in the UK, the Starmer government, is actually looking to renegotiate the free trade agreement between the UK and the EU. And I think that makes sense to try and do that, because I don't think the agreement is a good enough agreement. The UK and the EU should, now they have an excellent agreement because they were once part of the same customs union. It ought to be very easy for them to develop a decent free trade agreement. And so I'm aware the UK, I think, is looking for someone right now to lead that negotiation, but I'm not sure about the whole area of the European Court of Justice. But it is one of the complexities around negotiating a decent free trade agreement with the EU is that whole area of regulation. It's like the EU doesn't like allowing a free trade agreement with a country that may have less overbearing regulation than the EU has itself. It's as if they want to try and impose their whole regulatory approach, which is a process approach, a prescriptive approach, whereas countries like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and where the UK, I think, wants to head, is more to an outcomes-based regulatory approach, where our regulation is based on how do you achieve a given outcome, rather than going through a prescriptive process and basing all your regulation around, or much of your regulation around, detailed process, which is so damaging. That's what causes such damage to an economy, that kind of regulatory approach.
Right, fantastic. Well, that brings me on to one of the other questions that I have for you. But speaking about Great Britain, or rather the United Kingdom renegotiating that, I wasn't aware that was the case. And for the audience, you may not; those in the audience may not know one of the problems that the United Kingdom had with Brexit was because they'd been part of the European Union and before that the EEC for so long, and many trade negotiations were conducted supranationally by that organisation. It meant that there were a whole bunch of civil service roles in Whitehall Britain simply had existed for a generation, which is where people like Sir Lockwood came in when Britain needed to have the expertise in particular fields around trade negotiations, around primary industry, those sorts of things. They went out to the world to find people who could perform those functions, such as Sir Lockwood. And I have a joke to make. One of the problems that Great Britain had with that is that they really did get out-negotiated by Michel Barnier, who up until I think 2 days ago was the Prime Minister of France. If the joke I was about to make is, look, if I was looking for someone to renegotiate that deal, I hear that Michel Barnier might be looking for a job. But coming back to that, about the point you made about the prescriptive approach to regulation, there is a perception in New Zealand that the trade negotiations, that New Zealand did not get a particularly good deal in negotiations with Great Britain and with the European Union, precisely to that point. I've heard people say that, we've got a circumstance now where bureaucrats in Brussels are setting environmental standards for New Zealand farmers. Now, I suspect that might be a little bit overstated, but I'd be really interested in your view on the quality of those trade deals.
Yes, Simon, the two, to me, chalk and cheese. The free trade agreement with the UK, which I know better because I was advising the UK government on that agreement as a member of the United Kingdom's Trade and Agriculture Commission. They appointed me when I left London as High Commissioner and Ambassador to Ireland, and a High Commissioner to Ghana and Nigeria. So when I came back to New Zealand, a key group of ministers over there, Boris and Michael Gove and Liz Truss, all sort of said, we want to keep you involved here, because I'd done so much, I'd presented so many talks, or I'd done so much talking around the UK about how they could liberalise their agricultural system, how they could reduce its dependence on subsidies, how they could make it more effective in a modern world. So they appointed me to their Trade and Agriculture Commission. And under the UK law, under their, what do they call it, their CRAG Act, their Constitutional Reform and Governance Act. The government has a different process for ratifying trade agreements from what we have in New Zealand here. And so the Trade and Agriculture Commission that I've been serving on has to advise the government of the United Kingdom on all its free trade agreements post-Brexit. Initially, we were advising them on trade and agriculture policy. The first Trade and Agriculture Commission I served on advised the UK government on trade and agriculture policy, and we published our report on that and got all the farmers' unions in the UK, about 5 of them, there are all up, to agree to free and open trade with countries that could produce to equivalent standards, animal health and welfare standards and plant health standards and environmental standards to the United Kingdom itself. And that was a huge step forward because we had, before any negotiations even started, we had the big farmer organisations in the UK agreeing to trade liberalisation, if you like. That was a huge breakthrough. Then the UK government appointed me to their second Trade and Agriculture Commission, which was established to advise them on their free trade agreements, the first 2 being the Australian and New Zealand free trade agreements. So I had a big role in those. I even appeared in front of the UK Parliament, advising on both the Australian and appeared twice, once on the Australian free trade agreement. They owe me a bit, the Aussies, because I helped them get that one through. There were more issues with that one than there were with the New Zealand one. And I also appeared in front of their Parliament committee on the New Zealand free trade agreement. And then, of course, the third big one helped them get their accession to CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, the New Zealand-UK free trade agreement is excellent. It is a very good free trade agreement. By any standards, it is right up there among the good ones. And we'll have, basically, in a decade or so, we'll have absolute free and open trade with the UK. So that's great. The EU-New Zealand free trade agreement is not quite in the same league. And it's quite good in some ways for many products, but where, of course, it falls down completely, as you would know yourself, Simon, is the EU is so protectionist around agriculture that the New Zealand EU free trade agreement is very limited on the extent to which it provides better access for New Zealand agricultural products. And that's, I don't want to be too critical of the last Labor government here in New Zealand, but I think they should have been able to do a better job than that. I was a little bit aware of what was going on the inside there, and not as heavily as involved as it was in the UK, nothing like that. But I think there was a bit of a feeling among some that we should have done better. Wouldn't have done a lot better. It's not as if we could have got immediately free open trade with the EU. That was never going to happen on agricultural products. But we should have been able to do a bit better than we have. That said, I don't think there's any prospect of renegotiating that in the near future. I think the EU's got real challenges on its hands at the moment. With farmers are protesting all over the place. The French economy is not looking brilliant at the moment, as you've already pointed out. In the Netherlands, Dutch farmers have been protesting around all sorts of things. So there's a lot of disruption, if you like, already in EU agriculture, and I don't think they're going to anytime soon be prepared to make further progress with New Zealand. I'd like to think I'm wrong, and I might be wrong, but I'm just not so sure about that. And as for Brussels being able to tell us what to do, what's driven that comment a bit is the EU is looking at introducing a regulation where they want to be able to determine on any product imported into the EU whether or not deforestation is associated with its production. Things like palm oil, if you like. I guess that's what's driven part of this move, is some people think that with the production of palm oil, you get wholesale clearance of palm forests in Asia, if you like, in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, it may be in Papua New Guinea. But in fact, we looked into that on the Trade and Agriculture Commission, my work with the United Kingdom. We looked at that in real detail. And there are very good procedures now in place there in those countries to make sure that there is not, that they cannot produce for export palm oil that's been derived from, areas that have been cleared of rainforests and put into palm trees, if you like. And so it's interesting that the EU's gone down this track. They've delayed the regulation for a year because even their own farmers were struggling to comply. Their own member countries were struggling to comply with this new regulation. So it wasn't just on imports; it would also apply to EU countries as well. And some of their own member countries would have struggled to comply with what was an overburdening regulation, an ill thought through regulation. And of course, what's crazy about the thought that it might impact New Zealand negatively, in our country, one of our big problems is afforestation. A lot of good farmland in New Zealand being planted in pine trees, of all things, And so it's an interesting area. I think the EU will look again at that regulation, but I don't think renegotiation of our free trade agreement with the EU is on the cards in the immediate future.
Okay, all right. Well, I've just brought up a document on the broadcast. The audience can see it, but you cannot. But what the audience is looking at behind you and I is one of the sections from the European trade deal, which I'll just read a little bit of and get a little bit of comment from you. This is chapter 20, and it's on Maori trade and economic cooperation. It starts off saying that they're going to look to negotiate ethnic trade. There's a whole bunch of definitions. There's talk about the Treaty of Waitangi, of course, and so on and so forth. I think that the current government would be less inclined to make these sorts of arrangements. I think that the current government would see this as just embedding the ideology of the previous government in trade deals as they did in other sections of society. I wonder if there isn't scope for renegotiation of some of this sort of stuff, because of course some of it is good. Let me bring this up so the audience can see this section. Chapter 2 is talking about national treatment and market access for goods, including Manuka honey, Manuka oil, and other goods like that, which are of interest to Maori, but of course are, for want of a better term, New Zealand intellectual property. So the two questions I have for you, Sir Lockwood, is firstly, if do you think that there may be some interest in those aspects, and secondly, how important are these provisions inside that trade agreement? By which I mean, are these just really words on a page, or is this actually being put into practice?
It's an interesting issue you've raised, Simon. I mean, the Treaty of Waitangi chapter appeared first in the UK New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. I'd never seen it in any free trade agreement before. And it was lobbed in partway through the negotiation. New Zealand was well ahead of Australia. Australia had some real issues around sugar and animal welfare. They had issues around mulesing of merino sheep. I was able to help them a bit with that. But anyhow, we were well ahead of them on ours. Ours was much more straightforward negotiation. The Labour government lobbed in that chapter on the Treaty of Waitangi, and that put us back 2 or 3 months, because the United Kingdom then needed to work out what it meant. And I actually appeared in front of one of the main sets of questions thrown at me when I was appearing in front of the Trade Committee of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, was around that chapter. So it wasn't as if the UK wanted it particularly. And I think I eased their concerns a bit, and I'd eased New Zealanders' concerns, I think, about it. One of the important elements in it, I think, is protecting the cultural property, if you like, of Māori people. And I think that's a fair and reasonable thing, because I think the All Blacks have probably made a haka or kapa haka something that many countries are aware of around the world. And Māori kapa haka is a unique thing that New Zealand Māori people and New Zealanders have. And I think it's worth protecting and making sure that intellectual property surrounding it is protected in our free trade agreements. So I think it's not a huge issue. And so I don't expect the current government to look to change any of those chapters and those agreements. In fact, I think the latest trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council may also have a similar chapter in it. And that's, of course, been negotiated, or the negotiation's been completed by the current government. And I'm not 100% sure about that, but I suspect it has. And so I wouldn't be too concerned about those things. I think there are intellectual properties that Māori have an interest in protecting. And I think if a trade agreement can help enhance trade with Maori interests here in New Zealand, that's no bad thing for New Zealand, because I think everyone would acknowledge that Maori, on so many of our indices, if you like, be it from health to education, aren't doing as well as we'd love to see them doing. And so if an agreement can help foster trade, you've already mentioned manuka, honey, which is something Maori have a lot of interest in. It's interesting, through my work chairing the board of the Reddit Research Institute, which is our research institute on food science and future foods, if you like, human sort of food structure, digestion and health. There's some of the work of the Reddit is involved with Maori organisations. They're involved in some really interesting, innovative work on new foods and utilising some of the resources they have available to them. And so I think all of that, there's no problem with all of that I see.
Fantastic. That's wonderful news, and that is right. I think that particularly if there is cultural knowledge which is saleable out in the world, it is right and proper that the original owners of that are suitably compensated, and I think it's in all of our collective interest. No matter what the Aussies think about what counts as manuka honey and doesn't. All right. Well, look, I think that, guys, we might be having a few issues with the quality of the broadcast. I see that in the chat. Sir Lockwood and I might take a break for a couple of minutes. I think the issue is probably on my end. Like, I noticed that my own machine is actually using up a whole bunch of resource, and I suspect it's because I'm using a slightly different mechanism to conduct this interview. So do let me know how you're finding the audio quality and the video quality on the platform that you're coming in on. I'm going to play a little bit of music for just a few minutes and have a quick chat to Sir Lockwood. Let me know in the chat that, and then I'll go through some of your questions to hit Sir Lockwood up with. Guys, you are watching Simon TV. It is wonderful that you could be here with us this evening.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Simon. It's something we've got no control over. What those supermarkets are doing is, because New Zealand lamb is so popular, they use it as a loss leader. So at times of the year, they use New Zealand lamb to get people into their supermarkets. They'll often position it well back in the supermarket so that people have got to go through other stuff to access it. But we don't have any control over that. We're selling lamb on at a global price, if you like, and where those big supermarket chains choose to, cut their, I guess not making a loss on it, but really reduce their margins. We can't stop them doing that. And so I know it does frustrate people, but that's just the reality of how big supermarket chains work. It's a really interesting one, because other people, of course, say that one of New Zealand's problems is that we export agricultural commodities, if you like, that because we're not producing high-tech, apart from maybe Rocket Lab that does amazingly high-tech stuff, and, of course, Fisher and Paykel Healthcare that does amazing stuff around medical technology, medical instruments that are world-leading. Apart from those special examples, a lot of 75, 80% of our exports are from prime ministries, and people say that some people say that in the next century that's going to be to our disadvantage. I'm not sure it is going to be to our disadvantage, because you've got, in a world where you've got millions and millions and millions of people sort of emerging into the middle classes, if you like, from being pretty impoverished in past decades, they want healthy food. And healthy food involves protein, not just protein per se. But what I know a bit from my own scientific background, but it's been reinforced with the work I do at the Reddit Research Institute. But the proteins are, again, so diverse. And one of the valuable things about the protein New Zealand produces, protein from red meat and from dairy products, is those proteins are of such high quality. There's been developed internationally now a sort of an available indispensable amino acid index. and a lot of foods have now been assessed under that international index, if you like. And it just shows how valuable milk proteins and red meat proteins are to human well-being, to human nutrition. And you can take some plant materials, for example, do have quite a lot of protein in them. But the problem is they don't contain, few of them contain what I used to call essential amino acids that are now called indispensable amino acids. And it's the amino acids that make up proteins. And proteins are simply a whole lot of amino acids joined together. And even the plants that do contain some of those essential amino acids, often they're not bioavailable. We can't access them. When we eat that plant material, our bodies cannot access those amino acids as readily as our bodies can access those essential amino acids from meat and dairy products. And so I think as science shows more and more the importance of that, I think the demand for quality protein is going to grow as we look ahead to the next century. And New Zealand is so well placed to provide that. And the other thing I'd observe is that, if you take your cell phone, a thing like this, I remember I had one of the first cell phones when I was Minister of Education way back in the early 90s. It was like carrying around a huge brick. And, these things, the only reason why they keep costing a little bit more is they keep having to put more and more stuff into them. Early cell phones didn't have cameras, didn't have half the things that these things have. I mean, the power of this cell phone is far greater than a significant computer 30 years ago. And so, technology tends to get cheaper as time goes on. It gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Quality protein, I think, is going to get more and more expensive because the world's going to need quality protein, and it's not so easy to produce it in that many countries of the world. Now, we are looking to try and produce it from all sorts of other sources, from precision fermentation, you name it, all sorts of extracting proteins from plant leaves and then processing those proteins to make the amino acids more bioavailable, all that sort of thing. We can do all those sorts of things. We've all heard of, what was that terrible meat stuff they produced? Beyond, what was it? Beyond Meat or something? I can't remember now. But there are real challenges because the RIDDIT is involved in a lot of that research around alternative proteins. The research outfit I chair is involved in a lot of that work, and they're doing some really good and exciting work in that area. But it's not going to be, in the near future that we're going to have large quantities of high quality protein available from those procedures. It'll happen, but it's not going to be in the next little while.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how much of a threat it is either, Sir Lockwood, in that if New Zealand continues to produce what is perceived in the market as premium proteins, the consumer appetite for doing things like eating, artificial lab-grown meats or meat substitutes from things like insect sources I'm sure that is a market that will grow. But given the opportunity of sitting down in a 3-Michelin restaurant and having a bug burger or having a New Zealand eye fillet steak, I think that people will eye fillet.
I think you're right too, Simon. And I'm still involved in beef farming. Often people wonder how we care for our animals. This afternoon, I've got a bull who hurt himself. He's a big fella. He's well over a ton, heading towards 1.5 tons. He's a big boy. His last day out with the herd, he hurt himself. And he's hurt himself quite badly. He's hurt his back. Old people should be careful of this. This is an older bull. He's about, how old is he? Let me think. He's a 6-year-old bull. And he can't get around so well these last few days. And today was a very hot day. So there's Sir Lockwood carrying buckets of water to this bull this afternoon. I took 4 bucketfuls of water to him to make sure that he got water to keep him going till he finds I think he's hurt his back. And when you hurt your back, it takes a while for it to get around again. I got him to move about 50 meters, so he's moving. But that's what caring for animals is all about, and that's what New Zealand livestock production systems are about. We farmers actually do care for our animals in big time.
Oh, absolutely, and and have always done so. And I think that this is something that many people, I think that some of our trade partners, for instance, in the European Union, don't quite realise just how standard our very very good animal welfare care is in the country. And I also believe that there are many people who might vote for environmental type parties from the comfort of inner city suburbs who don't quite appreciate just how true that is. And it's other things too. Like I see, for example, the quality breeding programs around things like livestock improvement, and the genetic tracking that's been going on in this country for decades before any other country even looked to adopt a similar sort of system. So my next question in that regard is how much of that sort of knowledge is also an export commodity for New Zealand?
I think it is and has been, Simon. I mean, great New Zealand scientists have been involved in helping developing countries improve their agricultural systems, their food production systems, if you like, for years. When I was a student at Massey with your father, I was very much inspired by a New Zealand scientist called C.P. McMeekin, Dr. Campbell Percy McMeekin, and he became chief agricultural advisor, I think, to the World Bank, and helped many countries. So he was a great scientist, and helped many countries develop their food production systems, and that carries on. You'll be aware that while I was High Commissioner in the United Kingdom, of course, I served on the board of the Commonwealth Secretariat, and also was appointed by New Zealand to the board of the Commonwealth of Learning, and that's an interesting organisation. It's the educational arm of the Commonwealth, and one of the key programs the Commonwealth of Learning runs in developing countries is a program called Lifelong Learning for Farmers. And it's an exciting program. It's amazing how well it works. Interestingly, most of those farmers in our least developed Commonwealth countries are women. The women in the families who run the little farms, if you like. And by helping those women with access information, how to produce better crops, providing bank finance to help them buy higher quality seeds to sow to get better quality crops, helping with them with the technology, how to support the growth of their crops, how to harvest them, how to store the food, all that sort of thing. The Lifelong Learning for Farmers used to help these women with, but the whole family was better off through it. And it's amazing the difference that our scientific knowledge can make to people producing food in countries that are much less well off than us.
And I think that's absolutely incredible and thoroughly admirable. I think that you're exactly right. The strength of any culture often tends to be the women being, sort of hearth and home, and particularly when it comes to things like programs around the world, which focus very much on educating women in poorer countries. It seems to have a significant impact upon the welfare of all. And I'm very very encouraged to hear that there is a focus upon that inside the Commonwealth. I understand also with those sorts of programs, there's also financial elements. They're not with sort of loans to people and those sorts of things.
Indeed, yeah. Part of the program is providing access to finance, loans, cheap loans to the people involved in the program, because often they have very limited resources, and it's a way of they can pay back the loan when they harvest the crop, and so they build their future and can pay back loans, and it's worked remarkably well. I was unaware of it, so I became involved with the Commonwealth of Learning, and it does some great work in the least developed countries, if you like, of the Commonwealth.
Which is fantastic, and I think that this is part of the conversation which is often lost. Particularly, I see this from right-wing commentators. Often, people mention things to me in the chat. There are a lot of people who are sort of saying, "Look, globalization doesn't work. We have all these issues around the World Economic Forum, Schwab, and some of the things that happen in the WTO, all of that sort of stuff." And I think that perhaps what is often lost in the conversation is that the essential objective is to improve the well-being of everyone through these programs.
You're so right. And of course, that's been the great objective of the World Trade Organization. And, that organization, I guess, was developed, if my memory serves me correctly, in the very early 90s, following what was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. And it's done huge work for the GATT, and the Uruguay round of the World Trade Organization has raised more people out of poverty globally than I think any other human effort and endeavor, if you like. And it's kind of sad that at the moment, the World Trade Organization is struggling a bit because the Americans have refused to support the appointment of judges to the appellate body of the World Trade Organization, and it means that disputes can't be properly settled there now. But even so, I think it still can do very, very valuable work. And it's really interesting. While you're right that at the moment there's a bit of a move back towards nationalism, and I guess it's led by America a bit in recent years, whereas America used to be leading globalization, if you like. But these things tend to go in cycles. I never forget one day I was talking to the late Queen, Her Majesty the late Queen, an amazing person. I was chatting to her about economic issues and lamenting how some policies had seen trade struggling, if you like. And she made the interesting observation. She said, "High Commissioner, I've seen it go round and round and round." And she, because she had lived such a great life and been involved in so much, policy thinking over the years, and seen so much happen and all around the Commonwealth over the years. And that's what she said. "I've seen it go round and round." And so they go in cycles. I just hope the cycle towards away from the importance of trade liberalization will be a short-lived cycle, because trade liberalization is so important to global well-being and to New Zealand, of course, because we depend so much on trade, being a small economy, small country.
Fantastic. Well, I thoroughly concur, and I think that brings us nicely back to the start of the conversation, which was, I was looking at these matters very much from a New Zealand perspective, but you're right, there is a global impact, and it is about improving the welfare of everyone. I think before we conclude, Sir Lockwood, would it be fair to say that in your assessment, the next few years of the world are going to be challenging times, not just economically, but geopolitically and geostrategically?
Absolutely. Sadly, I think you're right, Simon. I mean, my life has been following the Second World War. I grew up in the shadow of the Second World War. I was born not long after my father returned home from the Second World War. And so, we saw the effort, the struggle to recover from the Second World War, and then we saw the wonderful period of time as the GATT and the WTO saw economies saw freedom and trade liberalization expand. I was in fact the first trade minister in the world to sign China up to the World Trade Organization, and no one else was prepared to do it. And at times I wondered, was it the right thing to do? I think it was. And of course, that's one of the reasons why New Zealand was one of the early countries to get a free trade agreement with China, because we'd done so many things. We're one of the first to recognize the Chinese economy as a market economy. We're the first to sign them up to the WTO, and so it goes on. And so, it's, but as we look ahead now, we're seeing a period of rising tensions, which is so unfortunate. It's not just happened in the last couple of years. I remember I was hosting the Chinese president at Parliament, President Xi Jinping, before he was president, and spent quite a long time chatting to him. And I could see from talking to him then, he was mindful of some of these, in his mind were some of these tensions emerging. And now, of course, we have the dreadful situation in Ukraine, in the Middle East. And it was interesting how Boris Johnson made the point when he was in Auckland last week. And I admire Boris Johnson, even though many people criticise him. I don't think they appreciate the intellect of that man, and his knowledge. Anyhow, he made the point that they are challenging times right now. And it's incumbent on those of us in the free world, in the democratic world, to work together to make sure that those who would take away our freedoms, those who don't believe that free people have the best lives, that free people can do great things. You know, if you look at the whole Enlightenment, it was made possible partly through greater freedom for people. And the Enlightenment brought more freedom for people. And so Boris, it was one of his most powerful messages that we cannot afford to let those who see the future in authoritarianism and less freedom for people, we cannot let them win the challenges that confront us today. And I think he's right. While I was Speaker, I studied the evolution of modern democracy in the United Kingdom, or in England, if you like, over the centuries. And it was hard fought for. No king or queen ever gave up their powers without being forced to do so by some pretty determined people. And so the glorious revolution of, when was it, 1688 was it, and the development of the constitutional monarchy, which of course is the basis of our constitutional arrangements here in New Zealand. The constitutional monarchy has been a superb constitutional organisation, so highly successful. When I was involved with the Commonwealth Secretariat, I served on a committee that was set up to help countries having constitutional problems. None of them were ever the constitutional monarchies in the Commonwealth. They were always the republics, because the challenge in the republics is to get the relationship between the executive, the Congress, and the judicial system in the correct balance. And the constitutional monarchy does that extraordinarily well. And I sometimes think we don't realise just how lucky we are in that regard.
Well, Sir Lockwood, and I think we're also lucky to have representatives such as yourself fighting the good fight. All right, well, thank you very much for your time. It is just always fascinating when I have the opportunity to speak with you. To the audience, I'm sorry there's been a few issues with the broadcast. I was doing things a little bit differently, but I'm sure on your behalf, Sir Lockwood taking the time to speak with us, and perhaps ask him to come on again, perhaps when Simon has his stuff together a little bit better, so that we can improve the quality of it. But for now, I will say good evening. Thank you very much. Merry Christmas.
Thank you.